The words that came from Princess Hana's mouth were filled with such cold fury that even the seasoned crew of the Indomitable felt ice run down their spines, and she said, "I will paint the stars with their blood and make them remember why the galaxy once feared the Valreth name." And Jiwan nodded once because that was exactly the answer he expected from a warrior princess who had lost everything to these same enemies. The Indomitable jumped to hyperspace immediately and pushed its engines far, beyond safe limits, because Sun He worked miracles in the engine room and coaxed more power from systems that should have melted under the strain, but somehow held together through duct tape and hope and human stubbornness that refused to accept mechanical limitations as anything more than suggestions. They dropped into normal space above the planet Arcadia 7, and the sight that greeted them was grim, because 15 Chromath warships surrounded the agricultural colony of New Sol, and plasma fire rained down on defensive shields that flickered and weakened with each impact. While on the ground, human colonists fought desperately against landing forces that outnumbered them. 10-1, Governor Kyung-soo stood in the colony command center with blood running down his face from a head wound and his old Marine uniform dirty and torn. But his voice remained steady as he coordinated the defense and refused every demand for surrender that came from the Chromath commander, who seemed to enjoy tormenting weaker species. Daehyun analyzed their tactical situation quickly and reported to Jiwon that they were looking at impossible odds, because one destroyer against 15 enemy warships was not a battle but a suicide mission, and the logical choice was to retreat and report the attack to Earth Command, and hope reinforcements arrived before the colony. Feljuan looked at his tactical officer, and then at Princess Hana, who stood on the bridge with amber eyes blazing and 4 hands already reaching for weapons, and he knew that logic had no place in this fight, because sometimes warriors had to stand against impossible odds, not because victory was likely, but because retreat was unthinkable. The captain of the Indomitable opened communications with the Chromath fleet and informed them that they had 10 seconds to withdraw before he turned their ships into debris, and the enemy commander laughed at the audacity of a single human vessel threatening an entire battle group, but that laughter died quickly when Jiwon followed his words with actions. The destroyer accelerated at full burn directly toward the Chromath flagship in a ramming course that no sane captain would attempt, but Jiwon had stopped being sane the day he watched his platoon die, and he had learned that sometimes the craziest plans worked precisely because the enemy never expected anyone to be that insane. Chromath ships scattered in confusion as the Indomitable roared past at speeds that should have torn the hull apart, and Jiwon executed a gravity slingshot around the planet that turned his ship into a missile aimed at the vulnerable engines of the nearest enemy cruiser, and the impact sent both vessels spinning. But the human ship had shields angled forward, while the Chromath ship had not expected such aggressive tactics. Princess Hana led a boarding party through the breach, because Valreth warriors thrived in close combat, where their forearms and natural strength gave them overwhelming advantage, and Daehyun followed her with a team of Marines who had been told they were probably going to die today, but decided to make it expensive for the enemy. The inside of the Chromath cruiser was chaos as Hana's berserker rage exploded through corridors designed for beings half her size, and her 4 hands wielded salvaged weapons and her own devastating strength as she tore through enemy soldiers who had never faced a Valreth warrior in their prime human Marines, fought beside her with grim determination, and used tactics that their instructors would have called suicidal, but which worked anyway, because humans had a gift for turning disadvantages into weapons, and they used the confined spaces to funnel enemies into killing zones where superior numbers meant nothing. Daehyun threw himself in front of plasma fire to protect Hana when she was momentarily surrounded, and took a shot to the shoulder that burned through his armor and flesh. But he kept firing because that was what humans did, and they did not abandon crew members even when those crew members could tear battle cruisers apart with their bare hands. Princess Hana pulled him to safety behind a bulkhead and demanded to know why he protected her when she was not his kind. And Daehyun grinned through teeth stained with blood and said, "You are crew now, and we do not leave crew behind because that is the human way." Something shifted in Hana at those words, because her own people had been warriors who valued individual glory above all else, and the concept of sacrificing oneself for another was considered weakness. But these humans treated it as strength, and she began to understand why such a young species had earned respect and fear across the galaxy. On the planet surface, Governor Kyung-soo rallied the colonists for another defensive push. And among them was young Bowman, who was barely old enough to vote, but who held a mining laser like a soldier, and had already taken down 2 Chromath war machines by targeting their cooling systems with knowledge learned from educational videos he watched as a child. The Chromath commander, Rasha, watched the battle from his flagship with growing frustration because these primitive humans should have broken already, but instead they fought harder with each passing minute. And now one of his cruisers had been captured by a boarding party, led by some kind of 4-armed demon that his soldiers described in terrified transmissions. Before going silent, Rasha ordered an orbital bombardment to wipe out the colony completely, because if he could not claim it, then he would destroy it and deny the humans their victory. But Jiwan anticipated this move because he understood how aggressive commanders thought, and he had positioned the captured cruiser for exactly this moment. The Indomitable and the captured Chromath vessel accelerated toward Rasha's flagship in a pincer movement that forced the enemy commander to choose between defending against 2 threats or following through with his bombardment order, and his hesitation cost him everything. Jiwan crashed the captured cruiser directly into the flagship's engines while his crew evacuated via drop pods that rained down toward the planet's surface like meteors, and the impact crippled both vessels and sent them spinning toward the planet's gravity well, while secondary explosions tore through decks and killed thousands in an instant. Princess Hana rode a drop pod down through atmosphere with Daehyun and Mirai and other crew members who held on for dear life as the pod shook violently and burned with friction heat, and she realized with sudden clarity that humans willingly threw themselves into danger like this on a regular basis and somehow survived through luck and skill and sheer bloody-minded refusal to die. They crashed into the outskirts of New Seoul and emerged from smoking pods ready to fight, and found themselves surrounded by colonists who cheered at the sight of reinforcements even though the battle was far from over, and Chromath ground forces still outnumbered them significantly. Governor Kyung-soo met them at the defensive line and recognized Jiwan from old service records because they had both served in the Human Korvax War, and the governor clasped his fellow veteran's hand and said, "I hoped someone would answer our distress call, but I never expected you to crash a capital ship into their flagship." Jiwan shrugged and said, "Humans do not really do subtle warfare. And besides, the ship was already damaged beyond repair. So he figured he might as well make it count." And Kyung-soo laughed, despite the desperate situation, because that was the most human logic he had heard in years. The battle raged through the colony streets as human defenders fought with farming equipment and construction mechs and whatever weapons they could improvise, because colonists learned to be resourceful when they lived on frontier worlds where supply ships came irregularly and military protection was a distant dream. Young Bowman found himself fighting beside Princess Hana when a Chromath assault team pushed through the eastern barricade, and he watched in awe as the 4-armed warrior moved like death itself and turned enemy soldiers into broken meat. But what shocked him more was when she grabbed him and pulled him to safety, when a grenade threatened to tear him apart. She could have let the human boy die because he was not her responsibility, and she owed these people nothing. But she saved him anyway because she was starting to understand what Jiwan had tried to teach her about fighting for others, rather than just fighting for revenge. The remaining Chromath ships in orbit faced a choice, because their commander was dead and their flagship was falling into the planet, and the human destroyer somehow still functioned, despite damage that should have reduced it to scrap, and the crew of that impossible ship seemed ready to ram again, if necessary. The enemy fleet broke and retreated into hyperspace because no amount of glory was worth facing opponents who seemed to view death as an inconvenience rather than an ending. And besides, there were easier targets in the galaxy than colonies defended by humans who fought like cornered animals. Silence fell over New Seoul, broken only by the sounds of fires burning and wounded crying out for medical attention, and exhausted defenders collapsing where they stood, because adrenaline could only sustain the word of the Battle of Arcadia 7 spread through the frontier systems like wildfire, and the story grew with each retelling until it became legend about how a single human destroyer and the legendary Berserker Princess defeated a Chromath fleet against impossible odds and saved an entire colony from destruction. The Indomitable limped through space toward repair docks with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and systems held together by Sun He's engineering miracles and desperate prayers to machines that probably deserved worship, given how they continued functioning despite damage that would have killed lesser vessels. Princess Hana spent her recovery time in the observation deck, watching stars slide past and thinking about what she had witnessed during the battle, because the humans fought in ways that her warrior culture had never considered, and they turned weakness into strength through cooperation and sacrifice. Hyejin arrived at the repair station 3 days after the battle, and the human intelligence officer carried credentials from the Galactic Resistance that marked her as someone who operated in shadows and dealt with information more dangerous than weapons. She found Jiwon in a station bar, drinking something that burned, going down and staring at nothing, while the weight of recent violence pressed on shoulders that had carried too much for too many years. Hyejin sat down without invitation and ordered her own drink, and said that the Resistance had been watching him for months because humans who fought Chromath aggression were valuable, and a human who traveled with the last Valreth princess was invaluable. Jiwon looked at the intelligence officer with tired eyes and asked what the Resistance wanted from him, because everyone always wanted something, and nothing in the galaxy came without a price. The officer explained that dozens of species were tired of Chromath expansion and their brutal subjugation tactics, but most lacked the courage to fight back because the Empire seemed invincible and resistance seemed futile until humans showed them that even the mighty could bleed. She said that humanity's reckless bravery and Princess Hana's tactical brilliance could inspire real rebellion across frontier worlds where beings lived in fear of the next conquest and the next genocide, and if they stood together, they might actually win. The captain of the Indomitable was quiet for a long time before saying that he was a mercenary, not a revolutionary, and his crew signed up for dangerous jobs with good pay, not for suicidal crusades against galactic empires. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. Hyejin smiled and said she had read his military record from the Human Korvax War, and knew he had never been good at standing aside when others suffered. And besides, Princess Hana would not forgive him if he refused to fight the beings who destroyed her world. Jiwon found Hana in the training bay where she practiced ancient Valreth combat forms with forearms moving in patterns that looked like deadly dance, and he watched for a moment before interrupting to ask if she wanted to join a rebellion against the Chromath Empire. The princess stopped mid-strike and turned to face him with amber eyes that held questions and hope in equal measure, and she asked if he was serious about fighting the Empire, because that would mean facing fleets and armies and odds that made Arcadia 7 look easy. Jiwon said he was serious if she was willing, because the Resistance needed symbols to rally around. And what better symbol than a human crew and a Valreth princess fighting side by side against the species that thought themselves superior to all others. Hana approached the scarred captain and said that he showed her something during the battle that her people never understood, and it was that some things were worth fighting for beyond revenge, and now she wanted to show the galaxy what he showed her. The crew of the Indomitable voted on whether to join the Resistance because Jiwon believed in democracy, even aboard military vessels, and to everyone's surprise, the vote was unanimous in favor, despite the danger, because these humans had signed on for adventure. And what was more adventurous than rebellion, they traveled to Haven's End, which was a hidden asteroid base where refugees from Chromath conquests gathered and tried to rebuild lives shattered by violence and loss, and the base held thousands of beings from dozens of species united by shared trauma and desperate hope. Princess Hana walked through corridors filled with survivors and saw her own pain reflected in their eyes, and she met children who would never know their parents, and elders who watched their worlds burn, and warriors who lost their honor when they fled instead of fighting. Younga found her staring at a memorial wall covered with names of the dead, and the former slave introduced himself and shared his story of capture and escape and the years spent building this refuge for others like him. He told her about species she had never heard of that were erased from existence by Chromath expansion, and cultures that survived only in the memories of refugees, who carried their traditions like precious flames that might be extinguished by the slightest wind. Hana listened to stories that mirrored her own, and realized she was not alone in her grief, and not unique in her rage, and perhaps that meant her pain was not a burden to carry in isolation, but a strength to share with others who understood. The Resistance leadership asked her to address the gathered refugees, because they needed inspiration, and who better to provide it than a princess who survived genocide and fought back against impossible odds. She stood before thousands of beings in the main assembly hall and felt the weight of their expectations pressing down like gravity increased tenfold. But she also felt Jiwan standing beside her, and that gave her courage to speak. Princess Hana told them about her people's destruction and her years of rage, and how close she came to dying as a slave in an auction house where beings were bought and sold like property. But then she told them about humans. She said that humans were small and fragile and their ships held together by stubbornness and something called duct tape, and they should not survive in a galaxy of giants and empires. But they did. And did anyone know why? The crowd leaned forward in silence, waiting for the answer, and Hana's voice grew stronger as she explained that humans refused to quit and believed tomorrow could be better than today, even when logic said otherwise. She told them how humans adopted her and called her crew and fought beside her without fear and threw themselves in front of weapons to protect her, even though she was not their species. And she said if humans could stand against the Chromath, then so could they. Her speech ignited something in the refugees that had been dormant for too long, and hope spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass, and volunteers stepped forward to join the fight. Princess Hana began training mixed-species strike teams and taught them berserker battle techniques adapted for different physiologies and combined Valreth warrior traditions with human tactical improvisation that valued creativity over rigid doctrine. Jinwoo was a cocky human pilot who thought his cybernetic enhancements made him invincible, and he challenged Hana to a sparring match to prove humans could fight as well as Valreth warriors. The match lasted exactly 4 seconds before Hana disarmed him and put him on the floor with 3 of her 4 hands, while the 4th hand held his own weapon aimed at his face. But afterward she helped him up and said he had courage, and that was the first step, and she would teach him the rest if he was willing to learn. And Jinwoo became her most dedicated student. The days passed in a blur of training and planning and preparation, while intelligence reports came in about Chromath fleet movements and supply lines and vulnerable targets. Hyejin brought news that changed everything, and her face was grim as she reported that the Chromath were planning a massive strike against Earth itself because they hoped to crush humanity's spirit by destroying their homeworld. The timeline was brutal because they had only 3 weeks to prepare for the most important battle in galactic history, and the Resistance would need to mobilize every ship and every warrior if they hoped to stop the invasion fleet. Jiwan gathered his crew and explained the situation and asked who was willing to follow him into what might be their final battle. And once again the vote was unanimous because these humans had decided that Earth was worth dying for. Princess Hana stood before her trainees and told them that the time for preparation was over, and soon they would face the Chromath Empire in open battle, and many of them would die. But their deaths would mean something because they fought for freedom rather than conquest. She looked at Jiwan and Daehyun and Mirai and Sunhee and all the humans who showed her that warriors could fight for more than glory. And she knew that whatever happened in the coming battle, she had found something more valuable than revenge. The Resistance fleet began gathering at staging points throughout the sector, and ships of every size and design prepared for the journey to Earth where humanity's fate would be decided. Young-ho approached Hana before departure and asked if she thought they could win against an enemy that outnumbered them by factors that made victory seem impossible. Princess Hana remembered standing beside humans during the Battle of Arcadia 7 and watching them refuse to accept defeat even when logic demanded surrender. And she smiled, that fierce smile of a warrior who had found purpose beyond rage. She told Young-ho that humans taught her something important about the Chromath Armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, like a plague of locusts blotting out the stars, and 300 warships formed battle lines that stretched across space in formations designed to inspire terror and despair in those who opposed the Empire. Earth's defense fleet waited near Jupiter's orbit with 60 ships that represented everything humanity could muster on short notice, and Admiral Su-young stood on the bridge of her flagship with gray hair and hard eyes that had seen too many battles and lost too many friends, but her voice remained steady as she coordinated defensive positions. The Resistance arrived moments later with 40 mismatched vessels of various designs and capabilities, united only by shared determination to stop the invasion. and among them was the Indomitable, carrying a scarred human captain and a Valreth princess who had both lost everything but found purpose in protecting others. Jiwan's brother, Taeyang, commanded. Earth's flagship called the Defiant Dawn, and the reunion between siblings was strained because years had passed since they spoke, and old wounds had not healed from the argument that drove Jiwan away from Earth to become a mercenary. Taeyang blamed his brother for abandoning their homeworld when humanity needed every defender, and Jiwan had no good answer, except that he could not stay on a planet where every street reminded him of friends who died in the war. Princess Hana found the brothers arguing in a conference room aboard the flagship, and she interrupted without apology because warriors did not have time for family drama. When battle approached, she told Taeyang that his brother fought for what he believed in, just as Taeyang did, and today they needed to believe in the same thing, which was survival. And the older brother looked at the four-armed alien warrior who traveled with Jiwan and saw something in her eyes that reminded him why humans fought in the first place. The brothers reconciled enough to work together, because Taeyang understood fleet strategy and large-scale tactics, while Jiwan understood the Chromath mindset from years of fighting them across frontier worlds, and together they devised a plan that was desperate and dangerous and completely insane. Admiral Su Young listened to their strategy and said it violated every principle of naval warfare and would probably get them all killed. But she approved it anyway, because humans excelled at breaking rules and surviving things that should kill them. The Chromath sent a transmission demanding unconditional surrender and promised to spare civilian populations if Earth's military forces laid down their arms immediately and accepted imperial governance. Su Young's response was broadcast across all channels so every ship in both fleets could hear, and she said that humanity did not surrender and did not kneel, and if the Chromath wanted Earth, they would have to take it from the cold, dead hands of every human. Alive, the Chromath commander considered this response a declaration of suicide and ordered his fleet to advance because 300 ships against 100 was not a battle, but an execution. The battle began with long-range weapons fire that lit up space like a new sun being born, and Earth's defenders employed tactics that only humans would attempt, including kamikaze runs and minefields disguised as debris and weaponized civilian satellites that turned into improvised missiles. Princess Hana led a boarding party toward the Chromath Command dreadnought because the plan required destroying its communication array to prevent the enemy from coordinating their overwhelming numbers. Daehyun and Mirai and Sunhee joined her along with strike teams from a dozen different species trained in the techniques she taught them, and they launched from the Indomitable in assault pods that burned through defensive fire like meteors. The pods crashed into the dreadnought's hull and cut through armor with plasma torches, and the boarding teams poured into corridors designed for beings twice their size. But that just meant more room to maneuver. Hana's berserker rage exploded through her body as she led the charge, and her forearms wielded weapons taken from fallen enemies and her own devastating strength that could tear reinforced doors from their hinges. But this time her rage was controlled and directed rather than wild and consuming, because she remembered Jiwan's lessons about fighting with purpose instead of just fighting to destroy. The Chromath Grand Admiral waited in the command center, surrounded by his personal guard, and when Princess Hana burst through the final door, he recognized her immediately because her face was in intelligence reports from the genocide 5 years ago. He taunted her and said the Valreth were weak and deserved extinction because they failed to adapt to a changing galaxy, and their rigid warrior culture made them predictable and easy. To destroy Hana felt rage surge through her veins like molten metal, and 4 hands clenched into fists that could crush bone. But she remembered Jiwan saying that revenge was a meal that never filled, and she forced herself to think tactically. The Grand Admiral expected blind fury and positioned his guards to exploit the predictable attack patterns of Valreth berserkers. But Hana had learned from humans to combine different fighting styles and adapt to circumstances. She used her berserker strength with human tactical flexibility and fought in ways that confused enemies trained to counter traditional Valreth warriors, and the Grand Admiral's guards fell one by one despite their superior armor and weapons. Daehyun took plasma fire that burned through his armor, and Mirai dragged him to cover while using her empathic abilities to project pain back at attacking enemies and give her teammates precious seconds. Sunhee reached the communication array and began overriding security protocols with techniques she learned from years of making impossible repairs to systems that should not function. The Grand Admiral drew his own weapon and faced Princess Hana in single combat, and said that killing him would not bring back her people or erase the genocide from history. Hana advanced with forearms ready to tear him apart, and her voice was cold as the void when she said she knew her people were gone forever. But history would remember the Valreth and would also remember the Chromath as the empire that underestimated humanity and paid the ultimate price. The fight was brutal and short because rage combined with tactical brilliance was more dangerous than rage alone, and the Grand Admiral fell with the realization that he had created the weapon that would destroy his fleet by giving Princess Hana a reason to master her anger instead of being consumed by it. Sunhee destroyed the communication array, and the Chromath fleet fell into disarray as individual ship captains lost coordination with command authority and began making independent decisions that conflicted with overall strategy. Jiwan and Taiyang exploited the chaos by focusing all available firepower on enemy command ships, and one by one the Chromath leadership was eliminated by humans who refused to accept defeat. But victory came at terrible cost because the Indomitable was crippled by plasma torpedoes that tore through the engine section, and Taiyang's flagship took a direct hit that killed half the crew and sent the ship spinning out of control. Thousands died on both sides, and space filled with debris and escape pods, and the screams of wounded transmitted across emergency channels, just when it seemed the Chromath might still. Overwhelmed through sheer numbers despite their losses, something unexpected happened that changed everything. Reinforcements arrived, but not from Earth, and instead ships jumped into the system from across the galaxy, representing species that had heard Princess Hana's speech and seen humanity stand and decided to join the fight. The resistance had become an alliance, and dozens of species stood together against the Chromath because Hana showed them that even berserker princesses could find hope, and humans showed them that courage was contagious. The Chromath fleet broke under the combined assault, and surviving ships retreated into hyperspace, rather than face enemies who fought not for conquest, but for the simple right to exist. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by rescue operations and damage control, and the sound of warriors breathing hard and realizing they survived the impossible. Princess Hana stood in the wreckage of the command dreadnought covered in blood that was mostly not her own, and she felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. The rage that sustained her for 5 years was finally gone, because she had avenged her people not through blind destruction, but through showing the galaxy that the Valreth spirit lived on in her and would inspire others long after the last member of her species was Dustjuwan found her among the debris, and his cybernetic arm sparked from damage, and his face had new scars to add to the collection. But he smiled that sad, knowing smile and said they did it and Earth was saved. Weeks later, on a recovering Earth, a memorial was held for the fallen, and representatives from 30 species attended, because the Battle of Sol had proven that unity was stronger than division. Princess Hana stood beside Jiwan as speakers talked about sacrifice and courage and hope, and she realized she was no longer just a warrior seeking vengeance, but a symbol of something larger. Jiwan offered her command of a new resistance fleet because she earned it through her leadership and tactical brilliance, and the respect of warriors from across the galaxy. Hana looked at the diverse crowd of humans and aliens and refugees and idealists, and she shook her head. Because humans taught her that leadership was not about titles but about standing beside those who fought for what was right. Lieutenant Daewon Kim sat in the pilot seat of the small shuttle and watched the massive alien ship grow larger in the viewport, and his hands were steady on the controls, even though his heart beat faster than usual, because this was it. This was the moment humanity had been preparing for since they invented faster-than-light travel 3 years ago, and found out they were not alone in the universe. And now they were about to meet the Vrenth Collective face-to-face for the first time, and everything depended on the next few hours. Behind him in the passenger compartment sat Dr. Hana Park, who was reviewing her notes on the tablet for the 100th time, and Commander Taemin Cho, who stared out the window with his jaw set tight, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say, and they had practiced this meeting 1,000 times back on Earth, and they knew their roles and they knew the stakes, and if this went wrong, then humanity might face a war. They could not win against an empire that had ruled this part of space for longer than human civilization had existed. The Vrenth flagship was like nothing humanity had ever built, and it stretched for kilometers in every direction. and its surface was dark and angular with sharp edges that seemed designed to look threatening, and there were no windows that Daewon could see, and no lights except for a single docking bay that glowed red like an open mouth, and he guided the shuttle toward it while trying not to think about how much it looked like they were being swallowed. The shuttle settled onto the deck with a soft thump, and the docking clamps engaged with a metallic clang that echoed through the hull, and for a moment nobody moved, and then Hana stood up and smoothed down her diplomatic uniform and said, "We should go," and her voice was calm even though Daewon could see her hands shaking just a little bit, and Taemin nodded and checked his sidearm one last time, even though they all knew it would be useless if things went bad, and they were outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1 out here in deep space. The airlock opened and the air that rushed in was cold and smelled like metal, and something else that Daewon could not identify, and it made his nose itch, and they stepped out onto the deck and saw the Vrenth for the first time, and Daewon felt his breath catch in his throat because these were not the friendly aliens from the old movies, and these were something else entirely. The Vrenth stood nearly 3 meters tall, and their bodies were covered in segmented armor that looked like it grew from their skin, and their faces were narrow with too many eyes and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth, and they moved with a fluid grace that reminded Daewon of hunting cats, and there were dozens of them arranged in formation around the shuttle, and every one of them was watching the humans with an intensity that made his skin crawl. One of the Vrenth stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding stones, and the translator device in Daewon's ear converted it to words but not tone, and it said, "You will follow, and we will take you to Commander Kira, and you will speak only when spoken to, and you will show proper respect." And Hana nodded and said, "We understand, and thank you for allowing us to meet with you," and the Vrenth did not respond, and simply turned and began walking, and the humans followed. They walked through corridors that were too dark and too narrow, and the walls seemed to press in from all sides, and Daewon noticed that everything was designed to make visitors feel small and trapped, and there was no art and no decoration, and only bare metal and sharp corners, and sometimes they passed other Vrenth who stopped to stare at them with those too many eyes, and he tried not to look back and tried to keep walking, and tried to ignore the feeling that they were walking into. A trap. The meeting chamber was vast and circular, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness high above, and in the center was a raised platform where Commander Kira waited, and she was larger than the other Vrenth, and her armor was darker and covered in markings that might have been battle scars or rank insignia, and beside her stood another Vrenth who watched the humans with what might have been curiosity, and Daewon learned later that this was Volsk, their chief scientist and researcher. Kyra spoke, and her voice filled the chamber, and the translator said, "You are the humans, and you are the ones who have entered our territory without permission, and who have refused to acknowledge our authority, and who have acted as though you have the right to travel where you please, and now you will learn what it means to face the Vrenth Collective, and you will understand your place in the order of things." Before Hana could respond, the lights went out and the chamber was plunged into complete darkness, and Daewon felt his hand move to his sidearm, but he stopped himself because drawing a weapon now would mean war, and then he smelled something sweet and sickly in the air, and his heart began to race and his palms began to sweat, and he felt fear rising in his chest like a living thing, and he understood that this was deliberate and this was a weapon. The darkness was filled with sounds, and there were screams and roars and the wet sounds of things tearing, and Daewon knew they were recordings, but his body did not care, and his body wanted to run and wanted to hide, and he heard Taemin breathing hard beside him and heard Hana gasp, and then lights began to appear, and they were images floating in the air, and they showed creatures that defied description, and they showed worlds burning, and they showed species that Daewon had never seen. And they were all dying and all being destroyed by the Vrenth, and the message was clear and simple, and it said, "This is what happens to those who do not submit." The lights came back on and Kira was watching them, and her mouth was open in what might have been a smile, and she said, "You have now felt what all species feel when they face us, and you have felt the fear that is proper, and now you will tell your leaders that they have 2 choices, and they can join the collective and accept our rule and live as servants, or they can refuse and face what you have just seen. And there will be no third option, and you have one of your weeks to decide." Hana stepped forward, and her face was pale, and there was sweat on her forehead, but her voice did not shake. And she said, "We came here to talk about peace and about cooperation between our peoples, and we believe that humanity and the Vrenth can both benefit from friendship and from trade and from sharing knowledge, and we do not wish to be enemies." And Kira made a sound that the translator could not interpret, but that sounded like contempt, and she said, "Friendship is for equals, and you are not our equals, and you will submit or you will be destroyed, and this meeting is over." They were escorted back to the shuttle, and nobody spoke, and Day One started the engines and backed away from the flagship and set course for home. And it was not until they were an hour away and back in human space that anyone said anything, and Taman was the one who broke the silence, and he said, "They are going to attack us," and Hana nodded and said, "Yes, and I do not think we can stop them." And Day One kept his eyes on the controls and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The message reached Earth before they did, and by the time they landed, the government had already made the decision, and humanity would not submit, and would not bow, and would fight if they had to. And Day One watched the news feeds and saw the preparations beginning, and saw the fleets being assembled, and saw the fear in people's faces. And he thought about the darkness in that chamber, and about the smell, and about the images, and he wondered if humanity had just made a terrible mistake. 3 days later, the Vrenth attacked the outer colonies, and the war began. And it began with fire and death, and humanity learned what it meant to face an empire that had conquered 100 worlds, and the first reports came in, and they were not good, and they were not good at all. And Day One sat in his quarters and stared at the wall and wondered if he would live to see the end of it. 6 months into the war, and humanity was losing badly, and everyone knew it, even though the news broadcast tried to pretend otherwise. And Specialist Minho Kang sat in the communications room of the defense station and listened to the distress calls coming in from the outer rim, and each one was worse than the last, and each one meant more lives lost and more ground given up to the Vrenth advance. The Vrenth fought like nothing humanity had ever faced, and they did not just attack military targets, and they attacked everything, and they used weapons that were designed to break the mind before they broke the body, and whole colonies went silent. After the Vrenth arrived, and when rescue ships finally reached them, they found people huddled in corners and staring at nothing and unable to speak about what they had seen. Minho had heard the reports about the new Vrenth weapon, and it was called the Nix Field Generator, and it was a device that somehow made fear into a physical thing, and it amplified every dark thought, and every nightmare, and every primal terror that lived in the back of the human mind. And when it was activated, people either froze completely or ran screaming in random directions, and either way, they stopped being effective fighters, and the Vrenth just walked in and took what they wanted. Dr. Hannah Park was working day and night, trying to understand Vrenth psychology, and trying to find some weakness they could exploit, and she had interviewed every human who had faced them and survived, and she had studied every piece of Vrenth technology they had managed to capture, and she was exhausted and frustrated because nothing made sense, and the Vrenth seemed to have no weaknesses at all. She sat in her laboratory and stared at the brain scans on her screen, and they showed what happened to a human mind under the influence of the Nix field, and the fear centers lit up like stars and overwhelmed everything else, and it was like watching someone drown in their own terror, and she had seen these scans 100 times now, and each time she saw them she felt a little more hopeless. But there was something strange in the data, and not every human responded the same way, and some people froze and some people ran, but some people fought anyway, and some people seemed barely affected at all, and Hannah could not figure out why, and she had tested for genetic differences and for psychological profiles and for everything she could think of, and there was no pattern, and it was like each human had their own unique relationship with fear. Minho was one of the unlucky ones, and his station was attacked on a Tuesday morning, and the Vrenth ships appeared without warning and started bombarding the station, and he was trying to send out a distress signal when the power failed, and the emergency lights came on, and he heard screaming from the other sections, and then the Vrenth boarded, and he knew what was coming next. They activated the Nix field, and Minho felt it wash over him like cold water, and suddenly he was drowning, and he was falling, and he was being chased by things he could not see, and his heart was hammering so hard he thought it would burst, and his hands were shaking, and he could not breathe, and he wanted to hide, and he wanted to curl up and disappear, and he wanted his mother, and he wanted to be anywhere but here. But even through the fear, there was a small part of his mind that stayed clear, and it watched everything from a distance, and it said, "You are not really drowning, and you are not really falling, and nothing is chasing you, and this is just a weapon, and it is not real." And that small part held on while the rest of him screamed, and when the Vrenth soldiers entered the communications room, he was still at his post, and still trying to delete the classified data before they could take it. They captured him and took him to their ship, and Volsk the Vrenth scientist was there, and he wanted to study the humans and understand why they kept fighting when they should have surrendered by now, and Minho became one of his test subjects, and it was not pleasant. And it was not pleasant at all. Volsk ran experiments and he exposed Minho to different levels of fear stimuli, and he measured his responses and he tried to find the breaking point, and Minho broke several times, and he cried, and he begged, and he said things he was ashamed of. But that small clear part of his mind never completely went away, and each time after the experiments ended, he pulled himself back together, and when Volsk asked him questions he said nothing useful, and just stared at the wall. Volsk was fascinated, and he had studied dozens of species over his long career, and he had seen how they all responded to fear, and they all broke eventually, and they all submitted, because that was the natural order, and the strong dominated the weak through terror, and that was how the universe worked, and that was how the Vrenth had built their empire, but these humans were different somehow. He wrote reports and sent them to Commander Kira, and he said the humans have something we have not seen before, and they can override their fear response, and they can force themselves to act even when every instinct tells them to flee, and this is not normal, and this is not how prey species behave, and we need to study this more before we can truly understand them. Kira read the reports and dismissed them, and she said Volsk was overthinking things and the humans were just stubborn, and they would learn eventually like every other species had learned, and all it would take was more pressure and more fear and more demonstrations of Vrenth power, and they would break and they would submit, and that would be the end of it. Meanwhile, on Earth and on the remaining human colonies, the civilian population was trying to cope with the war. And Ji-Wan Lee had been a teacher before the Vrenth came, and she had lived on a small farming colony called New Seoul, and she had been happy there, and she had thought she would grow old there, and then the Vrenth attacked. She remembered the ships appearing in the sky, and she remembered the Nix field activating, and she remembered the fear that made her vomit and made her collapse and made her want to die just to make it stop, and she remembered hiding in a storage cellar with 30 other people and listening to the sounds of the Vrenth moving through the settlement above them, and wondering if they would be found. They were found, and the Vrenth dragged them out into the light, and Ji-Wan thought they would be killed. But instead the Vrenth just looked at them and then left. And later she learned that the Vrenth usually did not kill everyone, and they left survivors, to spread fear and to tell others what had happened and to make the next colony surrender more easily. Ji-Wan was evacuated to Earth, and she was given counseling and medicine and time to recover. But she did not recover, and she could not sleep without seeing those ships in her dreams, and she could not close her eyes without feeling that fear again. And she was angry, and she was so angry that sometimes she could not breathe. She started attending resistance meetings, and she started learning how to fight, and she started working with other survivors to organize supply lines and intelligence networks and safe houses and all the things that rebels did in the old stories. And she was not alone, and there were thousands like her, and they all had the same look in their eyes. Dr. Hannah Park met with some of these survivors and interviewed them for her research, and she met Ji-Wan and listened to her story and saw the anger burning in her eyes, and something clicked in Hannah's mind, and she understood something important. She went back to her laboratory and looked at the data again with fresh eyes, and she saw what she had missed before, and it was obvious now, and she wondered how she had not seen it earlier, and the answer was simple and terrifying, and it changed everything. The Vrenth were afraid, and they were afraid of everything, and they were afraid of being weak and afraid of being vulnerable and afraid of the unknown. And their entire civilization was built on controlling fear, and they controlled it by making everyone else more afraid than they were, and by being the biggest and scariest thing in the room, and as long as they were the scariest thing, they felt safe. Their technology was designed around fear, and their military tactics were based on fear, and their diplomacy was just organized intimidation, and they had conquered 100 worlds, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most frightening, and because every other species they met had decided that submitting was better than facing the terror. Hannah wrote her own report, and she sent it up the chain of command, and she said, "We have been thinking about this wrong, and we have been trying to match their strength, but we should be targeting their weakness, and their weakness is that they need us to be afraid, and if we stop being afraid, then their entire system breaks down." The generals read her report, and they were skeptical, and they said, "How do you stop being afraid when someone is pointing a fear gun at your head?" And Hannah said, "You do not stop being afraid, but you stop letting fear control you, and you accept that. You are terrified, and you act anyway, and humans can do this, and we have always been able to do this, and we just need to learn how to do it better." Minho was still in the Vrenth ship and still enduring Volsk's experiments, and he had lost track of how many days he had been there, and he was tired and hurting and scared, but that small, clear part of his mind was still there, and still watching, and still refusing to give up. And one day Volsk stopped in the middle of an experiment and just stared at him and said, "You are not like the others," and Minho smiled and said, "No, and we are really not."